everybody. Welcome back to Be Like Christ. We are talking about Matthew chapter 13 in this Bible study as part of our series through the New Testament. As always, go get the notes online on 2BeLikeChrist.com. Link is in the description below if you haven't done that. And also grab a copy of this book if you haven't. There's free ebook. Also Amazon.com. What is the Bible? Gives you some foundational info on, well, the Bible. Let's see, what else? Oh, also remember that you can listen to this Bible study on podcast if you would like. That's definitely easier for some people, and so that's available. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Podbean, some other Spotify. So search 2Be Like Christ, and you'll be able to find that podcast. Voice is a little bit shot tonight, and so we have some San Pellegrino, tangerine, and wild strawberry. Pinky out before we study. All right, here we go, Matthew chapter 13. This is a very popular chapter because it contains the parables of Jesus. If you don't know what a parable is, don't worry, we'll talk about it. Verses 1 through 2. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea, and great crowds gathered about him, so that he got into the boat and sat down, and the whole crowd stood on the beach. So make sure to keep this in context. It says the same day, so this is a continuation of what we just saw in Matthew chapter 12. The chapter breaks are not divinely inspired. They were just put in there later for people to easily navigate. And so remember, just keep this in context. It'll be helpful to us. Jesus is surrounded by a large crowd here, and he decides that he's going to push out into the sea a little bit in a boat and to preach to these people. And that would have been not only given him a little bit of personal space, but it also would have had a nice acoustic effect, because if you've ever been on the water, you know how the voice carries on the water. So he probably would have been able to be heard by a lot more people if he went out like this instead of stood on the dry land. So from the boat, Jesus is going to speak some of his most popular or most familiar words. And this chapter contains, I believe, 7 parables. So the first one is in verses 3 through 9. Let's read this. Probably one of the most famous. And he told them many things in parables, saying, A sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell on the rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprung up, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched. And since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on the good soil and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. He who has ears, let him hear. Maybe you've never heard the word parable before, and you're like, okay, I don't have any idea what that is. Let's give a quick, brief explanation, because it's not hard to understand. I almost went on without explaining it. A parable is just an illustration or a story that has some kind of heavenly meaning, some kind of spiritual meaning. So there's like the surface, which is just the physical story, but then it has a spiritual meaning that is on a deeper level. And so all of these things that Jesus is going to talk about, they're things that are very familiar to the people who lived during this time, but he wants them to look a little bit deeper at some of the spiritual applications and thoughts behind some of these things. Jesus' first parable is about a sower. To sow, definition, is to plant seed by scattering it on or in the earth. Now, that may be weird to us, but because we don't do it anymore. Farmers have tractors, and they go out, planters, and they put all the seeds in the ground in a nice order, and there's not a whole lot of spillage. I like that word. But here, this would have been the practice of a farmer going out after his field was tilled and prepared and watered and whatever needed to be done to prep it for growing the crop. They would take the seeds in probably a bag, and they would scatter them throughout the field. And those seeds would go down into the ground and would hopefully grow. As you can imagine, throwing seed is not a particularly precise practice. And sometimes those seeds are getting stuck to your hand, and they're going further than you want them to go. And it's that imprecision that allows for this parable to really have life or get its meaning. It's in those. That's where we can find the spiritual lessons. And so notice this with me. Some of the seeds that were thrown out fell on the path or on the edge of the plowed field, the part that hadn't been plowed that people walked on. and they got gobbled up by the birds because they were just laying there on the surface, and birds like seeds. Some of the seed fell on rocky ground, and plants don't grow very well in the rocks because they need soil to dig their roots down into and get nutrients. But if they're just rocks, well, you can't get water out of a rock unless you're Moses, and so they're not going to be very secure. And they were scorched and dried when the sun came up. Some of the seeds fell on thorny ground. It started growing, but as soon as it got above the ground, it was choked out by thorns that were already present there. And then some of the seed fell on good ground and produced a harvest for the farmer. Jesus concludes this parable with a phrase that he's used a few times before to encourage his listeners to consider what he's just said, to look for that deeper meaning. He who has ears, let him hear. Now, we're not going to get the explanation of this parable right away. We have to wait a little bit until we move on in the chapter a little bit. Some of the parables of Jesus, he's going to give the explanations for. Those are the ones I really like because I don't have to figure it out for myself. But some of them, he's going to leave for us to figure out on our own. And so we'll look at both in this chapter, and we'll do both. Okay, verses 10 through 17, we have a conversation between the disciples of Jesus and himself. Then the disciples came, and they said to him, "Why do you speak in parables? Why do you speak to them in parables?" And he answered them, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand." So let's stop there at verse 13 and look at what what this conversation is about. Jesus finishes his first parable, and his disciples come up to him curious about why he's talking in a parable instead of just coming out and saying what he means. I think that's a pretty reasonable question. I kind of have the same question. And he tells them that although the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven are spoken plainly to them, it's not his intention that they ought to be spoken as plainly or as openly to the rest of the Jewish population. And you might also see that word mysteries and wonder, well, what are these mysteries? That sounds all very kind of mysterious. Sounds very mystical. Well, what are the mysteries? And it's important to understand the way that the Bible uses the word mystery. We'll come across it quite a few times if the Lord wills that we continue this Bible study. But it almost always carries the same meaning. And it's not something that we have to be like, ooh, it's a secret and no one can figure it out. Let's talk about it. The Bible uses the term mystery most often to refer to the hidden plan of God, what God is doing in the world that may be revealed to us partially, may not be revealed to us, but it's God's will. So none of the Old Testament characters who had come before these events knew the complete plan of God to save the world. Prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, they all got kind of part of the puzzle. They had pieces of the puzzle. Certain things were revealed to them. They had certain prophecies that they foretold would happen in the future, but none of them had the full, complete picture of just exactly what God was doing and how he was going to redeem Israel, much less save the entire world and bless all nations through the line of Abraham. The mystery of the kingdom was finally revealed when Jesus came to the earth and he died and he resurrected. Paul mentions this mystery when he was writing to Timothy after Jesus had gone back to heaven. So this is further on in the New Testament. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16. He tells us what the mystery is, what it was. "Great indeed, we confess, is the mystery of godliness. He was manifested in the flesh." So Jesus was manifested in the flesh, vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, taken up into glory. So that's just what the mystery is. It's the will of God, the plan of God, in bringing about the salvation of the world. And we now have the ability to understand that in a much more complete way than anyone in the Old Testament did. And so the mystery is not a mystery any longer. sure, there are some things that we aren't given all the details about, that God has chosen not to give us the details about. But the big plan, the big idea, theme, plot, kind of the world story, we know that now because we live on the other side of the cross, and we now know about the death, burial, and the resurrection of Jesus as the sacrificial lamb. So when Jesus is saying here, he says that he's going to speak in greater detail about the mysteries of the kingdom to the apostles. So his inner circle. They were the ones that were going to be tasked with sharing the gospel and launching the church, if you want to use that language, on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. And they were the ones who were going to be with him, and so they needed more than the average Jew, and they were privileged to have that. Also, their hearts were fertile ground for this kind of instruction, whereas, at least in general, the major population of the Jews were not accepting of Christ's message. So the apostles heard willingly, and they were teachable students, but many of the other Jews were not. And so that leads us into verse 12, and I think some of the explanation for that verse. So he says, and in this verse I find a little bit difficult, but he says, "For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away." So we have to figure out who these two groups are. Who are the ones who have and will receive more? Who are the ones who don't have, and what they have will be taken away from them? So first group first. Who are the ones who have? So I understand this to be a person who has an open heart and a desire to learn from God, like the apostles, that they're teachable. They have an openness to accepting the Christ and his message and the mysteries of godliness. This is a person who hungers and thirsts after righteousness, like Matthew chapter 5, verse 6 talks about. And God is going to use a person like this and continue feeding them and continue refining them. And they're going to receive an abundance and a satisfying portion of what God has for them. Those who hunger and thirst will be filled, right? So that's what he's talking about here. To the one who has, who's open to these things, who receives some truths and receives them well, more will be given to him, to her. Whereas the one who does not have, in contrast to the one we just talked about, this would be a person whose mind and heart is closed off to the gospel. So they've received the gospel message maybe for the first time, so they have a little bit of that information, but they're not open to it. They're not willing to consider it, not willing to find any truth in it or even look for any truth in it. And so their heart is not very good ground for the growth of this seed. They hear Jesus' words, but they do not take root, and there's no semblance of growth anywhere, and they're taken away by Satan. So what little they have is taken away by Satan. It could also be that little bit is taken away by God. This language reminds me of Matthew chapter 25, where there's the parable about the servants of the master. They all receive a different amount of money, and they're all supposed to be good stewards of that money. They're all supposed to use it well, and one of them doesn't. And what he was given was taken away from him because he used it poorly. He wasn't responsible with it. So the idea being, if we are given an opportunity and we're given teaching and we're given knowledge from God and we don't steward it properly, what we've been given will be taken away from us, and nothing else will be given. Matthew chapter 25, verse 28 and 29, that similar language. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. So that faithful steward, he was faithful with what he was given. He did a good job, and so he received even more. Whereas the unfaithful servant had only a little bit, but he didn't steward it well, and it was taken away from him and given to somebody else. this is kind of why Jesus spoke in parables, as he's still kind of explaining that whole question, because parables communicated the necessary truths to the hearts of good soil, but concealed those truths from hearts that were hardened and not willing to accept it. Those whose minds were spiritually prepared to accept Christ would hear the story and the parable and would be able to understand the deeper spiritual meaning. Those whose minds were not spiritually prepared to accept and hear that story, they would hear the external physical story, and that it wouldn't go any further than that, right? There would be no gospel growth. So my question is, why didn't Jesus just speak plainly so that everyone could understand? And I guess that's particularly my question, because as preachers or teachers of the Bible, that's what we try to do. So why doesn't Jesus just kind of come out with it plain and simple and then say, if you have an accepting heart, accept it. If not, don't accept it? And the answer that I would have to that, other than what Jesus has just provided to us here, is I'm not sure. I really don't know why Jesus approaches it this way, but obviously this is the most effective way to approach it, else he wouldn't have done it, and the most effective to accomplish what he's trying to accomplish. So he's definitely doing it for the reasons that he's just explained. Beyond that, I can't really provide any answers, even though I still have some questions about why it was handled this way. But perhaps this was something that only Jesus could do, because this isn't the way that we present the gospel. Jesus had an intimate knowledge of everyone's heart, every individual who was listening to him, and he had the proper words to tailor his message precisely for the occasion, right? When I preach the gospel, I don't preach it in parables and say, you guys figure it out. Maybe I should, but I don't have that kind of intimate knowledge. And so when we preach, typically we try to make it as simple, as plain as possible, and then we paint with a broad brush, and we kind of just let the chips fall where they will. Let that seed fall on honest hearts. And so our approach is a little bit different than Jesus's. Now, I think that might have something to do with his omniscience and his ability to preach in this highly effective way that I may not be able to do. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. Let me know. But I guess the apostle's question here is my question as well. Why do you teach this way? Why not just come out straight with it? Perhaps I'm just missing something in that text. But all right, verses 14 through 17. We haven't read these yet, but we need to. Verses 14 through 17. Indeed, in their case, so he's talking about those who are not willing to accept the gospel. In their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled that says, you will indeed hear, but never understand, and you will indeed see, but never perceive. But this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they have closed, lest they shall see with their see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For truly I say to you, many prophets and righteous people longed to see what you see, and did not see it, to hear what you hear, and did not hear it. The prophecy of Isaiah here comes from Isaiah chapter 6, verses 9 through 10, and we won't read it for the sake of time, but very similar language. He's talking about here how individuals will have had their senses dulled. They ought to be able to use their senses to find out the truth and to come to a conclusion, the spiritual meanings of these parables, but they've been dulled by rebellion and resistance to God. This was true for the Jews during the days of Isaiah, and it was still true during Christ's time. The people had become so stubborn and obstinate towards God that their senses had been dull. For so long they had resisted God's call, and now they wouldn't know God even if he stood in front of them and revealed the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven that they had been waiting on for so long. How do we know that? Because that's exactly what's happening. God is standing in front of them and revealing the mysteries of the kingdom, and they're like, not going to accept that. not going to accept this guy who's teaching these things. Maybe they heard those words, but like the two soils, soils in the middle of that parable, it just didn't get very far in their lives because they were stubborn. I know that when I was a kid, and maybe sometimes still, when my wife tells me things that I don't want to hear, what do? You stick your fingers in your ear like, oh, I can't hear you, because we don't want to heed the words that we are, or if we hear the words, right, we have to respond to them, and we'd rather just not. We'd rather just pretend like we don't hear something so that we don't have to respond to it. Here, the Jews are kind of in that same situation. They're just, dulling all of their senses, closing their eyes and plugging their ears, and like, we're just not going to listen, right? Because of their rebellion. Let's see. I wrote here, I did that with my parents because I didn't want to hear my parents' words because I didn't want to have to follow through with what I heard. And in a less humorous way, the Jews had closed their ears and their eyes to Christ's instruction. If they had opened their ears and their eyes, they would have been able to discern some of these spiritual truths, but they couldn't because they were blind. In verse 16, Jesus blesses the apostles because they weren't like their fellow countrymen. And as we mentioned earlier, there's this verse here about, let me read this again. Verse 17, "For truly I say to you, many prophets and righteous people have longed to see what you see and did not see it, and to hear what you hear and did not hear it." There are many people in the Old Testament, like those prophets that we mentioned, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Daniel, who the Bible tells us long to look into some of these mysteries of the kingdom, but they just couldn't, because God didn't reveal that to them in their given time. The apostles were in a very privileged position to be the first to really understand these mysteries. And that privilege shouldn't be understated, I don't think. And can't be understated. Later in the New Testament, Peter says that even the angels had a desire to look into God's redeeming work, but they didn't even have the ability to see exactly what God was doing. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 10 through 12 talks about that, and that's there in your notes if you want to go back and read that. So now verses 18 through 23. Hear then the parable. So this is going to be the explanation of the parable of the sower. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is what was sown along the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while, and when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately he falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. As for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it. He indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. So Jesus moves now to explain the parable of the sowers. There's 4 types of ground in the parable, and each of them represent the heart of a particular type of individual. So the first one is the seed that fell on the path that got gobbled up by the birds. Seed falling on the hard, unplowed pathway that people are trampling down as they walk between the fields, it's not going to grow because it can't get down into the ground to get that nourishment that it needs, and then ultimately to put any roots in the ground. So it's just laying there on the top of the soil, and that's easy pickings for the birds that come along. So this represents when the gospel is preached and the heart of the individual is hard, and they don't, quote, understand it. By understand, I don't think Jesus means to say that they've tried really hard to understand and they just can't get their head wrapped around it. This is they don't desire to understand. They're not taking any time, devoting any effort to understand what is being communicated in the gospel message. And so as soon as they hear that message, they just discard it as nonsense. Their heart is hard to it. They're not going to let that seed get down into their heart. So number 2 then is the seed that falls on the rocky ground. The seed that fell on the rocky ground sprouted very quickly. So there's some promise of life there, and it began to grow. However, it quickly died because its roots couldn't grow past the rocks and reach the dirt where all the nourishment and the water is. Rocks can't retain water like dirt can. It doesn't have the minerals in the soil that the dirt does. And so what he says about this is that as soon as persecution or, what does he say there? Tribulation or persecution come, because those roots aren't secured down in the soil, holding that plant upright and secure, whenever the winds of persecution or tribulation come along, any difficulties in the Christian life come along, they're just going to be blown away and destroyed, right? You're not going to get a harvest out of those people because they don't have any roots. So this illustrates those who have heard Jesus' message and gladly accepted it, but upon the first sign of resistance and persecution, abandon it because they had no foundation and stability. This would be a person who knows that they need Jesus, but doesn't count the cost before they choose to follow him, about what they could face potentially in being one of his followers. Number 3 then, the third soil, is the soil that fell in the thorny ground, or fell among the thorns. The seed that fell on the thorny ground sprouted quickly, just like the stuff that had fallen in the last soil, and it began to grow. However, the new growth is quickly choked out by the thorns, so it doesn't have a roots problem underneath the ground. It has a problem up above the soil line, in that there's thorns there, and they are choking out all of the new plants and killing them. This illustrates those who gladly accept the gospel, but are quickly distracted and entangled by the temptations of the world. So it's those thorns that are representative of the snares of the devil, and people get caught up in those. In the end, they can't escape the thorns and the temptations, and they never bear fruit. They never produce a harvest. Many new believers start off really well, are on fire, and they have tremendous potential in the kingdom, but find the allurements of the world ultimately greater than the allurements of Christ. And they go off and they pursue those earthly, physical passions rather than pursuing Christ. Now, there are a lot of people who try to live kind of in this middle ground of, well, I can go off and pursue some of these physical things, but I also can be on Christ's team. But you remember, as Jesus was talking about, when the Pharisees accused him of working for Beelzebul, he said, it's not one or the other. You got to be on one side or on the other side, and there's no in between. So here, it's one or the other. And then the fourth and final soil is the good ground. So this is a little bit more on the encouraging side, happy side of things. The good ground is where a seed is thrown and then it sinks down into the soil and it has an opportunity to grow because it has all the nutrients and security that it needs around it. This soil represents a heart that is ready and willing, like the ground, to accept the gospel message. But not only are they ready and willing to accept it initially, they have the endurance and the fortitude to overcome temptations and tribulations and to overcome and see past the lies and the snares of the devil. And ultimately, the end result of the gospel inside of an honest heart is that there will be a harvest grown, or a harvest will be produced. And he talks about there how some will produce harvests they'll produce harvests of varying amounts, right? But all of them will be producing fruit. And that's how Jesus says that we are to distinguish his disciples, is by the fruit that they produce. So that's the explanation of the parable of the sower. Pretty straightforward. Even a lot of kids can get a hold of that in children's Bible classes. But basic idea, but really a powerful image, and one that's you see show up all over the place. Let's read verses 24 through 30. Here we're going to get another parable about the kingdom of heaven. He put another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemies came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, 'Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds?' He said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' So the servant said to him, 'Then do you want us to go and gather them?' But he said, 'No, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at the harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" I've not had enough sleep, so I'm not very good at reading today. Sorry about that. So this is the second parable, and he puts this before his audience, and he provides the explanation, again, further down in the chapter. So it's not right here, but we'll get to it. And so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time digging into this right now, but we'll come back to this idea. But let's get the basic plot of the story. So there's a man, he has a field. He has the best seed. He has that good seed that he bought from a reputable guy, and he's going to go out and he's going to sow the seed in his field so he can have a good harvest in the fall. He does that. His servants do it. But then at night, some evil guy comes and he puts weed seed, not marijuana, weed seed though, in his field. So then the crop germinates and starts to come up, and the servants of the master, the good guy, they're like, "Didn't you plant good seed here? Why are there weeds and good crop in this field?" And the master says to them, "This must have been done by the evil one, somebody who was evil." The servants are like, "Oh, okay. Well, do you want us to go out and weed the field and get all the weeds out so that the harvest can grow, just the good seed?" And he says, "No, because when you're tearing out the weeds, you can rip up the wheat and its roots as well, and you might just destroy the whole thing. So let them grow together, and then when we harvest it and cut it all down, we can separate it then. We'll burn all the junk, and we will keep all the good stuff and put it in the barn." So that's the basic story here. We'll come back to that later, but let's move on to Jesus' next parable. I believe this is number 3. We'll look at 3 and 4 together because they're similar. He put another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all of the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches." He told them another parable. "The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour, till it was all leavened." So the first 2 verses there, 31 and 32, this is the third parable, and it's sometimes referred to as the parable of the mustard seed. He says, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. And when I was studying for this lesson, all I wanted was a simple picture of a mustard tree. Mustard tree or a mustard bush or whatever. Whatever this was that grew in Palestine, I just wanted a picture of it. So I went out, searched for it, and it took me on like an hour and a half adventure to discover the true identity of the mustard tree or bush, and I still don't have it figured out. And there's a lot of debate as to what exactly this tree was, and I got in more detail than I've ever wanted to get into about mustard trees in Palestine. So, all that being said, I cannot tell you exactly what this tree is, but there's some debate, and I'll give you the names of the trees that they think it is in case you too would like to spend an hour and a half of your life digging into the identity and exact species of the mustard tree. So some suggest that it is Salvadora perisca, or perisca. Yeah, that sounds right. It's in your notes. Salvadora perisca, while others suggest that it's Brassica nigra. Take your pick. Google them, look them up. Tell me which one you think it is down in the comments if you have no life and that's what you want to do. Either way, what we know about this plant that Jesus is talking about here is that it was some kind of a tree, or it was a shrub that germinated from a very small seed, and then it grew into a plant of significant size. Unlike the parable of the sower, or the parable of the weeds and the wheat, Jesus is not going to provide us with an explanation for what this means. Bummer. We have to think about it ourselves. But it's probably good for us. In my view, there's at least two explanations that I've heard put forward for this that I think are even worth looking at, and I want to look at them both. The same will be true for the parable of the leaven in verse 33. So let's look at these. The first interpretation is this. The mustard seed is very small, and yet grows into a large living tree, which provides shelter and a home for those who enter it. As we mentioned in the previous chapter, Jesus arrived on the scene in a very subtle, kind of quiet way. The kingdom of heaven starts off very small, but like the mustard seed, is going to grow very quickly. And we know that Christianity did grow very quickly after its humble beginnings in the city of Jerusalem in Acts chapter 2. So that's kind of the idea here, that the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. It starts out very small, grows into this giant thing. The second interpretation, thematically, it matches with the parable of the weeds and the wheat and the parable of the sower in some ways. Instead of the mustard seed's significant growth being viewed as a positive thing, in this interpretation, the growth of the mustard seed is viewed as a negative thing, in that it is swelling because all of these people have entered into it, but many of these people are not good, ultimately. They're like the 3 bad soils, or they're like the weeds in the field. They're coming into the kingdom of heaven, or being influenced by the kingdom of heaven, but it's not a good thing, right? Because eventually they're just going to be cast into the fiery furnace with all of the other weeds. So as the mustard tree grows, so does the influence of the evil enemy within it. And the birds are not seen as welcome guests, but there's some passages in the Old Testament that view the birds as being evil, not good. And so they take that, a few verses from the Old Testament, they say the birds aren't a good thing. It actually represents kind of evil coming and making a home in the tree, in the church, and that's kind of the idea behind it. Verse 33 then is the fourth parable, and it's the parable of the leaven, and we will also look at 2 interpretations of this. So the first interpretation is very similar to the mustard seed. The parable of the leaven is meant to illustrate how something small can have a huge impact on something else. So leaven is a very small ingredient. If you've ever made bread or cake, or I don't know if you put leaven in. You don't put leaven in cake. No, that's not true. If you put it in bread, when you go to church and take the Lord's Supper, you're eating unleavened bread, and what is it? It's like really flat, right? There's no like rise to it. Well, what makes bread like a loaf of bread that I have sitting over here? What makes that taller than that unleavened bread? Well, it's the leaven that's in it. It makes it expand. And if you've ever done it, you don't put a ton of leaven into your recipe. It's only a small amount. So the idea is the same. This small influence has a huge impact, and it expands rapidly. The church begins very small and humble, but expands very rapidly. The second interpretation is, again, one that kind of fits the overarching theme of these parables that we've looked at, and it's that leaven is a negative influence. It's not a good influence. In the case that they make, and it's true, that almost always when leaven is mentioned in the Bible, it's mentioned in a negative way. I don't know if it is every time, but many times it is. For example, Jesus is going to say later on in the book of Matthew, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. Beware of the influence of the Pharisees. And so they see that in the same way that they saw the birds, that them coming in and the expansion of the kingdom, a lot of the expansion is going to be a result of evil coming into the kingdom and causing havoc. and it will expand, but it will be difficult to distinguish who are the genuine disciples and who are the phony ones, and God will have to sort that out at the end of time. But the leaven is a bad thing. That's the second interpretation. And I'll just be honest, and you could probably figure out, based on the way that I interpreted those, that although I think that the second interpretations of both of those have some redeeming qualities, and I really like the way that they thematically fit in with the first two parables, I actually like interpretation number one for both of them better. It feels like Jesus' words fit better with the first interpretation, and you have to do a little bit more twisting and finagling to kind of get them to fit into the second interpretation. And so for that reason, I like the first interpretation of both of those a little bit better. Okay, so verses 34 through 35. I need some bubbly water here. Maybe some caffeine. 34 and 35. All these things Jesus said to the crowds in parables. Indeed, he said nothing to them without a parable. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, I will open my mouth in parables, and I will utter what has been hidden since the foundation of the world. That prophecy actually comes from Psalm chapter 78, verse 2, if you want to look that up. So Jesus is doing his preaching, and it's all in parables. Okay, verses 36 through 43 now. This is going to be the explanation of the second parable of the weeds and the wheat. What does all that mean? And here, this is a good reason why you should grab the notes online. I kind of break this down and just in a real simple way to help you kind of keep everything in order, because there's so many characters that Jesus explains, and there's quite a few symbols here. They all mean something, and it's hard to keep them all in order if you're just looking at the text sometimes and trying to figure it out. And so I have them nicely laid out in the notes, which will be helpful, I think. Then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples came to him, saying, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field." He answered, "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed is the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil ones. The enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels." Okay, so you have quite a few characters at play here, and that's where the notes will be helpful. Just as, verse 40, just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. Jesus goes back into the house, and his disciples ask him to explain this parable to them. And here's his explanation. Okay, you have the sower of the good seed. Who's that? That's the Son of Man. We know that that's Jesus. We have the field. The field is the world. We have the good seed, the wheat. Those are the sons of the kingdom. So Christians, followers of Jesus, those who accept his message. The bad seed, the weeds, are the sons of the evil one. So wicked people, people like the Pharisees, people like rebellious Jews who have hardened hearts that won't listen to Christ. We have the sower of the bad seed, the one who actually spreads it. That's Satan. And we have the harvest, and the harvest represents the end of the age, or the end of time. And the reapers are the angels, the servants who do the harvesting. So the explanation is, as the wheat and the weeds grew in the same field for the same at the same time, so the children of the kingdom will be interspersed in this world with children of wickedness, of those who refuse to follow Christ, who have hardened hearts to him. So they're going to be together while we're in this world, but the harvest, the end of time is coming, and when it does, Christians and the wicked will be forever separated. And the angels will take the wicked people and they will punish them forever in the fiery furnace is the language there. And it says it is reserved for all sources of sin and all sources of law breaking. And just a point here, and you also see this as we go throughout the rest of this chapter, is that there's a lot of people, not a lot of people, there's some people who argue that the concept of hell, as we're mostly familiar with it, is not a biblical concept. That you can't get that from reading the New Testament. And so they try to say, oh, it's not the way it's been described. Or a lot of times they'll try to dispose of that idea altogether. But as we read this, I'm not aware of another good explanation that somebody could put forward that would explain exactly what's intended here and what's being said here in Jesus' words about the fiery furnace and the punishment of the wicked. So this verse is pretty hard to dismiss, I think, and we'll see some others. The sons of the kingdom, they're not going to go to the fiery furnace. They are going to shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. So there's this promise of shared glory with the Father, of reigning with Christ to those who are faithful to him. The sons of the kingdom will be part of the kingdom of God in its fullest, final, sinless state, right, in heaven. And they will be gathered into the barns. So that's the explanation of that parable. I think that one's pretty straightforward once you get all the characters kind of aligned out. All right, verses 44 through 46. This is going to be parable 5 and 6. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has to buy that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one of great value went and sold all that he had and bought it. So we're going to take these two parables together because, again, they have very similar meanings and characteristics. In verse 44, Jesus tells us about a story of a man. He's walking in a field somewhere, not his own field, and he finds a treasure that's been hidden there. It's apparently a treasure of great value. So what he does is he goes off and he sells everything he has to raise the money that he can buy that field from the landowner, and then he gets to keep the treasure. I don't know if that's 100% honest or not, but I guess. He does buy it honestly, but he wants this treasure, right? More than anything else that he has, he wants this treasure. And he proceeds to sell all of his possessions. Verse 45 and 46 tells about a pearl hunter, a pearl merchant. He's in search of good pearls, and one day he comes across a pearl, and he's like, whoa, this is it. This is the best pearl I've ever seen. It's worth more money probably than all of my pearls combined. So what's he do? He goes off and he sells everything that he has so that he can buy the one pearl. Okay, so what do these parables mean? Both of these men came across an item of great value. They were willing to do whatever it took in order for them to obtain that item of great value. They valued what they had found more than all the possessions that they previously owned. That's important. The meaning is that those who discover something valuable, in this case, the most valuable thing, Jesus and the kingdom of heaven, those who discover the kingdom of heaven through the words being preached to them, through the preaching of Christ and John the Baptist, they had come to find something of inestimable value. However, not everyone who heard about the kingdom actually appreciated it. I won't get into that. Those who knew its great value, though, and appreciated it, were willing to do anything to enter the kingdom of heaven. No possession, no past relationships, no hindrances were going to get in their way of possessing this for themselves and taking part in it. You consider the apostles in this case, how they had given up everything, their professions, maybe some of their family, in order to follow Christ. And you notice also how the man who bought the field, it says that he went out and he sold his possessions in joy. There wasn't any sorrow that he was losing all of this stuff, because he knew the value of what he was sacrificing wasn't even comparable to what he was going to get out of it. And the same is true for Christians. And that's I mean, that's one of the big things that we need to realize in order to live the Christian life, or for somebody to lay aside their life and live for Christ, is that what we are going to receive in Christ is of inestimable value. It's so much better than anything that this world is going to offer us. But we've got to be able to see that. We've got to appreciate it in order to live for it. He talks about there, as we just read, that we are going to shine like the sun in the kingdom of our Father. I don't think anyone on earth can describe what that's going to be like, but it's going to be worth more than anything that we have here on the earth. And we need not to be like that seed that fell on the thorny ground and then got choked out by the possessions of the world. Satan comes to Jesus, and he offers them the kingdoms of the earth. Jesus knew that God could reward him in glory far better than what Satan was offering him, and so he stuck with God, and we've got to be able to do that same thing. Verses 47 through 50. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good into containers, but threw away the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So this is parable number 7. The meaning of this parable appears to share some similarities with some of the other parables that we've talked about, namely the sower and the weeds and the wheat. A net is thrown out into the sea, and it gathers all kinds of fish. The net probably represents the gospel message, and it attracts all kinds of people, some for the right reasons, some for not the right reasons. Much like the seed is thrown out and lands on all kinds of ground. When the net is full, it's taken ashore, and the fish are sorted. The good ones are kept in containers, but the other ones are thrown away. Much like the weeds and the wheat at the harvest time. The gospel, think about the interpretation here, the gospel has a wide influence, and some who are impacted by it respond positively, like the good fish. Others are bad fish, and they don't respond positively or the way that they should. Like the seed being thrown out by the sower, some hearts discard it, some hearts allow it to grow but don't lay down any roots, some hearts allow themselves to be distracted by the world, other hearts accept it and gladly bear fruit, and those are the good hearts. And so those are the 7 parables of Jesus in Matthew chapter 13. You've probably heard some of them before. Some of them, like the parable of the net, are not quite as popular. You don't hear them talked about as much. Maybe because that one's I think it's a little bit more tricky than the others to understand, but still not terribly hard. So I just want to make a few observations from these parables and Jesus' teaching before we close out this video. I guess we still have a few verses in the text to go, so this is a long chapter. Let's look a few observations from the parables. Jesus mentions the fires of judgment quite often in this, and we talked about how that relates to the doctrines of hell. But he's not gentle on the Jews. The Jews may have expected their Messiah to be gentle with them, but angry at all the other nations. But that's not what we find. Jesus is not gentle with the Jews, and they should have expected that, because of all of the language of God that had been delivered through the prophets in the Old Testament, right? God is very harsh at times when his people are rebellious. And so it should be expected that the Messiah, who is God, is going to speak in the same way about those who are rebellious against him. And indeed, we find that Jesus does. Not having a heart to accept Jesus is not a thing to be taken lightly. Also, another observation, at the beginning of the chapter, Jesus told his apostles that the vast majority of the Jews are not going to heed his teachings. However, he doesn't use that as an excuse not to preach. And there were, and there always have been, some who are ready to hear the gospel. No matter where you are in the world, there's some. And so a lesson I thought we could take away from this is we shouldn't use hardened hearts or the hardened hearts of the majority as an excuse not to share the good news at all. And I know that that's pretty common. I know that a lot of churches get discouraged because, and Christians individually get discouraged because they say, no one wants to listen to this. No one wants to talk about these kinds of things. We just live in a world where we have a lot of people with hardened hearts that aren't open to the gospel, and no one's interested in talking. So a lot of times churches will say, well, we haven't had a whole lot of success with this particular program, and so we're just going to stop. But they never replace that with anything else, right? So they're basically using people's hardened hearts as an excuse for why they don't need to fulfill their commitment and why they don't need to preach and try to reach people, and that shouldn't be the case. Jesus says up front here, many will not listen, but that doesn't keep him from preaching the gospel, because there will be a few, and those few will ultimately be worth it. And the final observation I have from the parables is that Jesus communicated these eternal truths. He's revealing the mysteries of the kingdom of God, mysteries that have been hidden for a long, long time. But he doesn't have to impress people with the eloquence of his sermon or the great craft with which he put together his sermon points. He doesn't have to alliterate all of his points, right? And we shouldn't fall into the thinking that effective gospel preaching always has to have flash, always needs to involve this kind of sermon craft that has developed in the church over the last, maybe several hundred years, and that it needs to have all of these elements and to be very well, fluently, eloquently spoken, right? It doesn't. Sometimes, and some of the best teaching that I've ever heard is just the simplest teaching. That doesn't mean that the truths that we're teaching are simple in and of themselves or easy even to apply, but we don't have to always dress up their communication in order for those words to be effective. Everyone knows these simple illustrations that Jesus is giving, and yet they're powerful truths. I think we can communicate the same way. I think there's a need for both. There is a need for the eloquence. There's also a need for the simple. And I think that's also, it's not as if the well-educated and spiritually mature need the eloquent and the simple babe Christians need the simple. Right? I think both people need both. You don't grow out of a need for simple common sense teaching just because you've matured a little bit in Christ. That can still be extraordinarily valuable to you, especially if it's communicated in the right way and by a person who really knows what they're doing. So anyway, rant over on that. Verses 51 through 52. Jesus asks his disciples, "Have you understood all of these things?" And they said to him, "Yes." And he said to them, "Therefore, every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house, who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old." Okay, so Jesus asks his disciples after he's finished all of these parables and explained some of them, "Do you understand everything that I've taught you?" And they respond, "Yes." And I can't help but question whether or not that was true. It's like when the teacher asks you in class, it's like, "Do you understand?" And you're just like, you wake up from your nap and you're like, "Oh, yeah, we understand." Because you don't want to have to like repeat the lessons, or you don't want to appear like you're dumb or something like that. So, "Oh yeah, we get it." I can't help but think that maybe the apostles were kind of like that, especially in light of their confusion about the kingdom later on. But I don't want to be too harsh on the apostles. I think the apostles get a hard. People are hard on them, but it's always people who have had all of the mysteries of the church and of redemption revealed to them ahead of time, right? I think if somebody was picking up for the Bible for the first time, they would probably have all the questions that the apostles had. And so it's easy to be harsh when we have the whole picture now, but I'm not so certain I wouldn't have been like the apostles in a lot of ways if I had had to listen to Jesus' teaching and had for so long been listening to bad Old Testament teaching from the scribes and the Pharisees and these people who I thought I was supposed to respect. Jesus is almost having to rework their entire minds in order to get their heads wrapped around this. And so I don't think it would have been easy. Verse 52, I find this a little bit of a challenging verse. Let's read it again. Therefore, every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house, who brings out of his house what is new and what is old. Okay, so how would a Jew understand the position of a scribe? Well, they would probably think about it in the sense of the scribes that we've already talked about in the book of Matthew, the scribes of the Old Testament law. So the scribes were enemies of Jesus, but they were the students and thought to be the scholars of the law of Moses. They were the ones who sat around and commentated about it, who wrote about it, who discussed the nuances about it. They were... if you had a question in your town about some principle of the Old Testament law, you'd probably go to the office of a scribe to have that answered. They were also able to draft legal documents in that area in Israel. And Jesus even told his apostles on one occasion, he said, you should do as they say, but don't act like them, because they don't follow through with completing the things that they say. So they do know the law in some ways and ought to be listened to. Just don't be a hypocrite like they're a hypocrite. So that's what a scribe was, a scholar of the law. The scribes that Jesus mentions in verse 52 are those who are trained for the kingdom of heaven. So what does that mean? What's that process look like? He means those who are trained, those who are scholars, who are well taught in the teachings of the kingdom of heaven, of Jesus's principles, of what he's doing here on earth. And who is it that is a scholar of those things, who knows those things, to whom those things are being revealed, who's being educated in those things? Well, it's his apostles, right? That he's already told at the beginning of the chapter, I speak plainly to you about the mysteries of the kingdom. So they are going to be the ones who are leading the charge in the early church. They are the scribes of the kingdom of heaven. Or I think this could also apply to anybody who possesses knowledge about the kingdom. They were going to be able to share as an authority those principles with other people who would come along later. So he says that these scribes, the scribes of the kingdom of heaven, were like masters, or the master of a rich house, who had in his possession treasures both new and old. Okay, what does that mean? What old and new treasure is possessed by the teachers of the kingdom? I think you can look at this in a general sense, also in maybe a more specific sense. Let's look at it in the general sense as well. Or first, man, I need to go to sleep. I think we can understand this verse to be saying that one trained in the kingdom of heaven will have the riches to appropriately help others no matter what situation they're in, right? If you need something old, they've got it. If you need something new, they've got it. They've got the gamut covered, right? They have what you need. I think that's the general idea. This scribe has the means to help in every single occasion. And Christians should be like that. Those well-trained in the principles of the kingdom of heaven should be able to rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep, encourage the disheartened, help to bring down the proud, admonish the proud, to walk in love. They can condemn evil if they have to condemn evil. They are gentle, but they can also be bold, right? Someone who takes all of Jesus's teachings into their heart and allows it to transform them and becomes a scribe of the kingdom of heaven, an expert in it, is going to have the capability to step into any circumstance or into any occasion and to be a helpful participant in those circumstances. I think that might be what Jesus is saying generally. What if we take those terms new and old a little bit more specifically? How could they be interpreted? In a more specific sense, the old and the new treasure may be referencing to the scribe's ability to pull from knowledge long possessed in the Old Testament, but also to pull from new knowledge obtained from Jesus' teaching. So there you have the old being the Old Testament, the new being the new covenant, and he's able to draw on all of these things in order to effectively communicate the gospel message to other people. When we consider Matthew's gospel here, we see that he actually does that quite well. Matthew is continually referencing prophetic treasures from the Old Testament, and he's then accurately combining those and aligning those with treasures of Jesus' new teaching about the kingdom of God and Jesus' life. And he's doing that to convince the Jews that Jesus is who he says he is, that they should accept him. So like someone would come to an Old Testament scribe to get a question answered about the old law and what God wanted them to do. Matthew is now displaying his skill as a scribe of the New Testament. When somebody comes and wants to know what God wants them to do, he's able to pull from all of these treasures that he's familiar with and has been trained in, and to provide a proper answer to somebody and a good answer to somebody. So if this more specific sense is taken, what we find is that Matthew fulfills Jesus' words here. He shows that Jesus' words about the capabilities of a scribe were true and came true. Okay, we're almost there. Verses 53 through 58. And when Jesus had finished these parables, he went away from there, and coming to his hometown, he taught them in their synagogues, so that they were astonished, and said, "Where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary, and not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? And are not all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all these things?" And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and in his household." And he did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. So upon the conclusion of the 7 parables, Jesus leaves the town, which was probably Capernaum, and he goes to his hometown, which would have been Nazareth. I don't have a map here for some reason. I need to add a map to these notes. But just think southwest of the Sea of Galilee. I think more west than south. But that's where Nazareth was located, and it's where he grew up. As could be expected, the people in the town were shocked when the hometown boy comes back, and he doesn't just come back, but he comes back teaching in their synagogues as one who has authority, has some, as if he's some religious scholar. Jesus, you think about this. This is where it's helpful to put yourself into the context of this passage. You think about these people. If you've grown up in a church, you've been sitting in church for many years with the same people. You've been familiar with the same people, loving the same people, talking to the same people. There's some people that have been around probably maybe your entire life, and you're familiar with them. Well, it would have been the same in the synagogue for Jesus. Jesus probably attended their synagogue countless times growing up. And he probably knew the faces in the audience that he was teaching to as he's getting up and doing this instruction. And they may have been people who pinched his cheeks and watched him run around the carpenter shop 25 years ago, and saw him grow up from just being a baby. And we don't have any indication that Jesus was ever trained in any kind of formal way as far as the laws of Judaism. And guess what? He may have been able, the people in Capernaum may not have known that, but the people in Nazareth did. They knew this guy. He wasn't educated in any kind of rabbinical school as far as we know, and they would have known. And so when he tries to teach in their synagogues, they're just like incredulous. They're like, what is this? They can't believe it. And instead of learning from his words, they started reminding each other of what they already thought that they knew about him. You notice this, they say, "Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't this Mary's boy? Don't we know his brothers? Don't we know his sisters? Where did he get all these crazy ideas and start thinking that he could start teaching us?" You remember Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 10, verse 6, where he said, "Blessed is the one who is not offended by me." Well, here it says that they took offense at Jesus. Jesus responded to them, and he said, the only place a prophet isn't honored is in his hometown. And that principle is true even today. And you think about it, I know that there's kind of a joke that goes around that a preacher cannot return to his hometown and be the preacher there, because everyone knew him growing up and will only ever see him as that young kid that he was. The same thing is happening really to Jesus here. They think that they know him. They don't think that there's anything that they can learn from him. These people have known him since childhood and would probably have a hard time taking him seriously. Even when you've matured, and grown up, a lot of the older generation will always only see you as like that kid that you were. And I'm not necessarily opposed to that. But in this case, that was a dangerous thing to do. And actually, I want to make the case that that can be a little bit dangerous for us to do as well. They rejected the message of Christ because of the package in which it was delivered. They thought they knew that package, and yet they didn't. So the application is this. It is dangerous and not uncommon for people to reject truth because the package in which it arrives doesn't meet their expectations. Now, we've already seen that with the Jews. They've rejected Christ because they're like, this isn't who we thought. We thought we were getting a political leader, not this guy from Galilee. So they rejected him just on the basis of the package that he came in. That can happen in our personal lives as well. This is what's happening to Jesus in Nazareth. There are some people who will not be taught by anyone who in their view is somehow inferior to them, or for some reason is disqualified in their mind from teaching them. They will not learn anything from a person who they've disqualified. But I think it's important to remember that truth is truth no matter where it comes from. I had a missionary friend of mine say that to me one time, and I haven't forgot it. Truth is truth no matter where it comes from. And I've seen all kinds of people refuse to learn from all kinds of other people because for some reason in their mind, there's some variable of that teacher that disqualifies them. And it could be almost anything. But old people sometimes refuse to learn from young people. What can this young whippersnapper have to teach me? I've been around forever. So anything that they're saying, I'm hardly listening to anyway. On the flip side of that, young people can refuse to learn from old people because they're like, wow, this guy's so ancient and he doesn't have anything to teach me. He doesn't even know what the modern world is like. Educated people can refuse to listen to people who are uneducated. And vice versa. There are uneducated people who refuse to listen to those who are educated. And when I say that, I mean formally educated. Like if you don't have the degree behind, or the letters behind your name, you don't have the degree, some people will just dismiss you outright and say, this guy can't teach me anything. It's also true that people with one doctrinal view refusing to learn anything from someone with a different doctrinal view. So let's say that I know that this guy doesn't agree with me when it comes to church leadership or complementarianism or baptism or the doctrines of grace, right? That guy doesn't believe like I believe on this particular point, and therefore he has nothing to teach me. I have heard that many times in my life. People have just outright dismissed anyone who doesn't agree with them 100% doctrinally. There's nothing that I can learn from anyone who would hold that position. And so they treat them like that. Like they don't have anything in the world to offer them. And that one blind spot on their part makes them completely devoid of seeing and communicating truth in any other aspect. The Jews' rejection of Jesus, so let me just say that it's important that we not do that. Sometimes, in 1 Corinthians, we're actually told that many who accept the gospel are not going to be noble. They're not going to be wise. They're not going to be the people who this world really respects. They might be the people who some would count as uneducated, or some would count as, old fuddy-duddies, or maybe young people who are just zealous for living for a purpose. And but they're not going to be the people that the world really respects. But they're also going to be the ones who are communicating the gospel, who are preaching it to the world and to other people. And if we allow ourselves to reject truth based on the package in which it's delivered, one of those individuals might come knocking on our door, and we might say, nah, you don't have anything to teach me. And they could have the words of life that they're going to share with us. And we turn them down because we don't like the way they look. So we've got to be really careful about the packages in which truth is delivered, and not tossing out truth because we don't like the way it's given, or the messenger that God uses to give it. All right, we got to finish this video. This is like my last point. The Jews' rejection of Jesus, and more specifically their rejection of Christ. Okay, I'm just going to read my notes. I can't hardly think. The Jews' rejection of Jesus, and more specifically the rejection of Christ by the Jews in Nazareth, should be a serious encouragement for us to keep our eyes open to truth coming at us from any direction. So we always have to be willing to intake truth no matter what direction it comes in. We've touched on that. And you notice the very last statement there is that Jesus didn't perform many miracles in his hometown. And the reason is because of their unbelief. So when we think about the purpose of miracles were intended to strengthen belief and confirm the words of the teacher. Because there was no willingness to even believe, Jesus didn't choose to perform those miracles as an evidence. His hometown people had already made their mind up about who he was, and that he didn't have anything to teach them. So that's the way that the chapter concludes. If you've hung with me, even in my poor reading and my uneloquent lesson, I appreciate it. I think I'm going to not film anymore tonight. But thank you again, everyone, for paying attention. I hope the notes will be valuable to you in communicating this a little bit better than I did. We are going to put together one book on Matthew of all of the notes when we're done. And so maybe when you complete this study, you can grab a book and give it to somebody else and help them walk through it as well. And so I think we'll probably have somewhere around 250, 300 pages in those notes by the time I get done. It might be more than that because the last parts of Matthew are long, the last couple chapters. There's a lot going on there. So we'll see, though. We're going to put it all together, and it'll be available to everybody. And so it'd be nice to have a hard copy, and I'm going to try to spruce them up a little bit so that they look a little bit better than just a regular old Word document. But that'll be good. It'll be available on Amazon, just like this book here. All right. Well, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, share this with your friends, hit that like button, comment down below if you have any input or would like to add to any of the points that I said, or correct me on any of the points that I said, or just give some constructive feedback to all of us. I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for hanging with us. Bye.